Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Agitprop Interviews. This series was designed to make people chill out and also to give an insight into some of the people that inspire me. Now, Agitprop was a website I created that was kind of a play on words because lifestyle, growth, beauty and travel spell out LGBT, and in all those areas of social media content I found it quite tricky to see myself. So in the pandemic I decided to create a website that actually combined all of those things, and in that I wanted to interview people. I absolutely love chatting to people and having the opportunity to meet so many amazing, incredible, I guess you would say, icons across the years has been an honour in my life, and I've been so privileged to meet James St. James a couple of times and do his makeup in the wonderful World of Wonder series many years ago now. And I got the opportunity to chat to James throughout the pandemic, and we had a wonderful convo that went on and on and on. Now, James has been an inspiration in my life for so many years because when I was growing up and I was looking at all these amazing resources for queer culture and queer history, Party Monster was a story that stood out. It connects the dots between so many of my inspirations, and he is a resource of so much. I really connect with him and his amazing energy, and I really loved the fact that we got this conversation happening. Definitely have to come back for another one because there's so many things I didn't get to ask, but I really enjoyed it. So please enjoy it too. Let me know what you think in the SoundCloud comments. Don't forget to share on your social media, and enjoy. So I always start out in these conversations asking where people's journey started, and I've read so much about your journey, but I wanted to hear a little bit more from you.
My journey. Can we define that a little bit? I feel like I've had 1,000 journeys in my life.
Yes. So I think a lot of people perceive the Club Kid era as being the genesis of James St. James, but you were very well known in New York before then. But how did you even get to New York before then?
Well, I went to New York to study theater at NYU. I studied experimental theater at the experimental theater wing of Tisch School of the Arts, and so I went to New York for that. I had the idea that I was going to open a theater and write and direct plays, and I was going to invent my own language in which the plays were spoken in. I had this whole thing all worked out that I was going to go and be a part of like the underground theater movement in New York. And I got to New York and I went to NYU, and after about like 6 months I realized that I hated actors. I just hated actors, and I dropped out. And by that time, after 6 months in New York, there was an article about me in Newsweek saying that I was the it boy of New York, and I was a celebutante, is what they dubbed me. And so then I just thought, well, I'm famous. I don't need to go to school. And I sort of, I spent the next year like going on, like, I went on Oprah, and I worked the whole East Coast morning news shows, like AM Baltimore, Good Morning Philadelphia. And I was doing those for about a year, and then partying in New York. So that was all sort of before the Club Kids, my celebutante years. And that was mostly thanks to Michael Musto, the brilliant gossip columnist for the Village Voice. And he took me under his wing and sort of introduced me to New York, and took me out every night and showed me the world. And I am forever grateful to him for that.
What was the New York scenes like then? Because that was when Andy Warhol was still with us, and from what I've read, he pulled the whole of New York together.
Well, he was the one person who was able to go from uptown to downtown to Broadway to fashion to, Hollywood, and he was, king everywhere he went. And so he always had an entourage filled with a bit of everybody, and as he moved from party to party, and you did see him every week at least, if not every night of the week, somewhere. And it was interesting because when he walked into a room, the room literally changed. You could feel the vibration like go up, and you could feel that everybody in the room was talking a little louder and was being a little more animated, and they were all trying to sort of get his attention and looking out of the corner of their eye to see if he was looking at them. And you could feel when he looked at you, when he noticed you. It was the weirdest. I've never experienced anything like that with any other star before, where he was like a star to stars, you know, and he just had that magical ability to transmute a party into, just raise it. The minute wherever he was the center of the universe.
At the time, like, there were these downtown darling type characters that I guess were also celebritantes at the time, and there was some trans women like Terry Toy and Connie Girl. Was that era?
I got to New York, it was in '84. It's summer of '84. It was right after that big Sprouse fashion show that he had done that just exploded when he and when Terry Toy was walking, and it was sort of that sort of day-glow '60s, and the graffiti and all the silver, and it was she was the most enigmatic, just presence. She was unbelievable, just so gorgeous and so fascinating, and such a sphinx that she just, she would sort of sit in the corner with her dark glasses and her dark black outfit and her black glasses and that hair. Oh, she was just wonderful. And I got to know her a little bit before she left. And then Connie Girl. Well, there was also Tish Gervais, who has a fabulous book out. Brian, oh God, he's going to kill me. Tish Gervais. Do you know about the story of Tish?
No, I don't.
Yeah. Okay. So there was another really big, fabulous transgender woman at the time named Tish Gervais, who has since gone on to transition back to being a man. And he now has written a book called Transfigured. His name is now Brian Belovich, and the book is absolutely fantastic. And I think that everyone should read it, because you talking about your gender studies with Brian's story of he talks about going from man to woman to man to drag queen to man to it's just the various lives that he has led along the way. Just absolutely fascinating, and a really interesting book. So Tish was on the scene. Connie Girl was a little bit later. Connie Girl was like 86, I think, with the Boy Bar Beauties. A lot of those girls, I'm trying to think, Princess Deandra, you might know, a bunch of them, but Boy Bar was sort of a whole other scene. It's interesting because there was a lot of things happening in drag in the 80s era right there. And you had like the Pyramid Club, which was deconstructing drag for the 80s in a theatrical setting. And then you had the Boy Bar Beauties, who were sort of redefining drag for the 80s and 90s, sort of as less about female impersonation and more about your own persona, coming up with your own character, which was still sort of a new concept at that time. I mean, Divine had done it, and Candy Darling and Holly, but mostly, I mean, there was still just a lot of female impersonators out there. And so Boy Bar was sort of transforming what we thought of drag was. And then there were, like the club kids who were sort of doing a genderqueer thing, like a sort of a non-binary. I always think of the club kids as the first safe space for genderqueer teens. Because the other places were about performance, and there were drag bars that were more pickup joints, but the Limelight and Tunnel were just about creativity and letting yourself go.
I'm so fascinated by the club kids and your story because when I was like a little crazy young teenager, me and my best friend were obsessed with the sort of like I was going to ask you about this, but I didn't know how to phrase it because I don't know what they were really called. But when we were all on MySpace, like around 2006, and I was like 13 or whatever, there was like this sort of not a regurgitation, but it was almost like the scene kids had hybridized some of the looks of the club kids and they were doing it on MySpace. And my friend at the time was obsessed with everything to do with the club kids and would run around the room with a pencil saying he pushed the prolapse out back with a pencil and all this, like all these quotes. All these crazy quotes. And we tried to have our own club night when I was like 16.
Because I guess Party Monster, the documentary, came out in 98, and then the Party Monster movie came out in 2003, and my book was 99. So I think there was that sort of 20-year resurgence again of the 80s and the club kids. And I think that, because I know I was doing a lot of parties at that time, hosting a lot of like club kid reunion parties and things like that. And so I do remember definitely there was that feeling that they were back.
Yes. And there was such like this concept, which I think I learned so much from reading the stories, but it was like this branding concept that I think translated so easily onto MySpace when MySpace really became that first social media platform. So where people would call themselves like a title in front of their names, or they would document things, but instead of it just being a picture, it would be a zine cover. And everything was like, I never saw that before. Did that happen?
I should say that because when I first got to New York, and there were people like Terry Toy and Diane Brill and John Sex, and just these larger than life like personalities and these larger than life looks. And I had this revelation that two of them. One, if you could take your look and reduce it to a pencil doodle, and still figure out who it was. Like John Sex, the hair, Diane Brill, the hair and the boobs and the outfit. Like if you could just sort of reduce your look to its very basic, but still get it across, like a Jane Mansfield or Phyllis Diller or something like that, then you were easily brandable. Like you were something you were sticky. You could stick in someone's mind. And the other thing was that there was a magazine called Details at the time that sort of chronicled nightlife and the nightlife figures. And to get into it, there were all these people who were stars that like, they should, why is, like superstar DJ Anita Sarko, superstar, door girl Sally Randall, superstar hairdresser Danilo, superstar makeup artist Way Bandy. And I just realized that you had to have, like you said, you had to have a title in front of your name in order to be taken seriously. And I couldn't be taken seriously. I couldn't be written about until I had something in front of my name, because I was just James St. James. I was just James. And it wasn't until Newsweek said Celebutant James St. James that that I was able to be written about, and I had something in front of my name that then people could say, oh, and then at the party was Celebutant James St. James. Like you had to have a describer in front of your name.
I think that's so clever, but it's so like, it just feels like the same energy that everyone wanted to do with this platform that was free. Because the impression I got from the club kids, which was different to the previous era, was the club kids kind of looked in some regards like they'd created everything themselves, as opposed to being in like a socialite family and like worked through a hierarchical system of the clubs. Was it very much like that?
Yeah. The scene before at the area Palladium days, and before that, I get Mud Club. I wasn't really at Mud Club, but so much of it was, the Bratty Trust Fund kids, and everyone was, coked out of their minds and sort of just posing in a corner in their Comme des Garçons. And it was a little snobby and a little elitist, but I think the club kids were sort of trying to turn all that on its ear and sort of make fun of it, but at the same time they were pushing beyond it. There was no standing in corners and posing with the club kids.
I was looking at the archive of, I think it's called Project X, which is and I think it's just so much imagery that was obviously just made in an organic way at the time has fed into fashion shows and books. It's like a magical alien time. It's something that I've always been fixated with. But did it feel like that at the time?
At the time, um, no, only because we were so immersed in it that I don't think we really had any concept of the impact we were having. I know that people come up to me all the time and say, oh my God, my mother stayed home to watch you on Donahue or Joan Rivers or Geraldo or whatever, or my grandmother did it. That one really pisses me off. But I know that, and you would hear things like, I remember hearing like that Richie Rich and Walt Paper were really famous in Japan, but like there was no way for us to gauge it, because there was no internet and there was no Instagram or Facebook or anything. I mean, there was no way to know, but like you would just hear, oh yeah, you're big in Belgium or something, like, but it had no influence on your life in any way. I do think now, and this is a whole other kind of conversation where people will say things like, Lady Gaga stole everything from the club kids, or like it's all, that the new Margiela collection is very club kid or whatever, and I don't know that that's true. I think that at this point the influences are like a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, where you don't realize that you're copying the club kids. You're just copying a look that is in the ether somewhere. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it completely. And I'm interested because the time frame was so many events were kind of happening, especially in the queer community. We're in a pandemic now, but there was the AIDS epidemic, I guess, that intersected with the club scene. And that was a little bit after the Blitz Club in London as well, wasn't it? Because the Blitz came a little bit before.
This was more around the era of Taboo and Kinky Girlinky.
Because I was trying to trace that. I was trying to do like a diagram of all the characters that kind of cross-pollinated, like Lee Bowery, and I think even Suzanne Barch went to Blitz. I think I heard her say once.
Suzanne was she was Switzerland, and then she moved to London in the 70s and then moved to New York, I think in 79, and would go back and forth. In fact, I think it was Suzanne, was the first to bring Vivienne Westwood, Gautier, and Lee Bowery and everybody to New York for a fashion show, for a punk fashion show or something. And that's the first time I met, it was at Limelight, in fact. It was at Limelight in 85. And she had a store in Soho, and she was the first to bring Gautier and Mugler and, like I said, Vivienne Westwood and Rachel Auburn, I believe was her name, Lee Bowery, and I think maybe even like Comme des Garçons was the first, Suzanne. So that's why when Suzanne started doing parties after the store closed, all the fashion community was so, they followed her, she's always had that fashion. They were very grateful to her for opening the door to the US. And so they all stayed with her for partying. And, I think that was very smart on her part.
Definitely. I have always wanted to ask someone, I don't really understand this, but there was something called a cabaret license. And was it like the mayor of New York introduced this sort of like antiquated law to stop people dancing in bars? What was this? What happened?
And you could not dance if you didn't. And they would literally, like if you were just sort of swaying to the music and your shoulders started shimmying, they would kick you out. They would come over. Yeah. And I think it's even still there. I don't, and it might even still be in Los Angeles too, but I think it's easier to get a cabaret license now. But yeah, no, that was definitely an antiquated thing. And I mean, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that Giuliani was doing everything he could to shut down every club in New York during the late 80s and early 90s, during that quality of life thing. And that goes into the whole Michael Ehrlich and Peter Gatien and all that stuff, which we will touch on soon, I have no doubt.
Well, it's been such a sort of like a sensationalistic thing to imagine, I guess, for all the queer kind of like young people who love to party and dress up, because I don't really know anyone from my generation that was necessarily into drugs. A lot of my friends didn't do drugs, but were still being so outrageous in London, and I didn't know if it was because of the timing was so different, or just because we were the copies of the copies of the copies or whatever. But I wanted to ask you, like, how drugs played a part into the scene, and is it because people were doing like ketamine that they were so creative, or I didn't know how that kind of it worked.
It's different drugs at different points of time. The 80s were just coke, 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 coke everywhere, in um, especially with like the trust fund kids and the Wall Street guys, and that. I mean, you have to realize, New York, the clubs were open until 4, and then there were after hours clubs that everybody went to, and then after hours clubs. And if you're still up at 8 in the morning, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning at a club, then you are either X'd out of your mind or you're coked out of your mind. There was just no two ways about it. And even if you weren't a drug person, at a certain point, somebody's going to offer you a bump and you're going to be like, oh, I'm exhausted. Yes. Okay. And like, that's just the way it was. I think in the 90s, as people were more, the longer you stayed in the club scene, the more drugs you took, probably, because to keep your energy up and to keep your, I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't know where I'm going with that. I do know that like looking at someone like Michael Ehrlich, who started off being very anti-drug and not approving of people doing drugs at his party, and just being very sort of puritanical about it. And then he started to like ecstasy, and he would have an ecstasy punch at his parties. And then I went away for a while. When I came back, he was a heroin addict. I mean, like that seemed like a progression that I saw with a lot of people. In the 80s, they came in, they were all fresh faced. And then by the time mid 90s rolled around, they were just sort of haggard old drug whores. Myself included.
No, I interviewed Glamorous Monique, and she told me a story where she took something and then I think she collapsed and her husband was dragging her through a sandbox or something. And it was fascinating. I wasn't quite sure.
Well, I mean, I think every addict has a story where they are in an alleyway and they're, looking for a dropped, crack rock in the garbage can, in the dumpster, and they end up in the hospital. I mean, like everybody has one of those, and then I was in Tijuana with, 3 nuns and in a Doberman Pinscher. Like, you have no idea, like just everyone has a story where things go off the rails.
Where did you go when you stepped away from the scene during that time?
Oh, in 90 or 91, I felt like I was at a creative end. And I was doing too much coke, and I wanted to see if I could write. I'd been writing for a magazine called Outweek, which was, very much, like ACT UP, a lot of it was a gay magazine that was about the AIDS crisis, and I had a column in it, in which was sort of they just let me do whatever I wanted to do, and I sort of wrote these stories about looking for crack rocks in a dumpster and ending up in the hospital. I mean, like the things I was to say. Every week I was having these crazy experiences, and the magazine suddenly folded, and I thought, well, I want to see if I can write long form, because I'm really enjoying this writing thing. And I want to see if I can go away somewhere and just write and get my head together and see if I could come up with a book maybe based on this column that I was doing, Diary of a Mad Queen. And so I went to South Beach, which was still in its infancy and was still sort of a ghost town a little bit. There was all those empty Art Deco buildings. Oh, so gorgeous. And like a very small drag community that was really just fun. And New Yorkers were just beginning to discover it and go down. So I went down there and I lived there for about 9 months and just wrote. And the problem was is that I went to Miami to get away from cocaine, which, if you know anything about America, that's not something you do, because there was more coke in Miami than, I was just crazy. So I ended up partying by the fourth or fifth month. I was writing an hour to a day and then partying 10 hours a day. So I ended up then going to LA for a while, and then I went to Michigan, where we had a home, and I spent this winter there writing before going back to New York.
So Michigan, this is my ignorance of the different states in America. Is Michigan quite conservative?
Michigan, yes, is very conservative. Now it is. Well, I guess it was when we were growing up too. But this was a tiny, tiny, tiny little town up in the northern area, the northern part of Michigan, and it was right on the lake. And we had a house that was like on a hill overlooking the lake, and it was absolutely perfect, because in the winter there were probably literally 200 people in the town, and it was just a really fantastic place. And so I really cherished that time that I had there.
Oh, did it inspire you to be in like a family place? Did that help your creative writing?
Well, I mean, I was alone. I was very much. I was just in this house, just literally snowed in for months at a time. And I remember there was a gay bar like 4 towns over, like 45 minutes away. And sometimes I would drive, and it was called the Side Tracks, I think. And I would drive, 45 minutes or an hour to go there at nighttime. And I'd go in, and there'd be like one old queen sloughed up against the bar. And that was it. Like, that was like the extent of my nightlife then. But I do remember, oh my God, this is so funny, because I was there and I was writing, and I went to the bar, and I was the only person there, I think. And they had a video monitor above the bar that played, music videos. And all of a sudden I saw, by God, it was RuPaul's Supermodel. And I hadn't known anything about it. I had no clue that she had a record, that she finally got a record deal, that she had a song and a music video. And I was like, oh my God, they're making drag queens into superstars. I have got to get the fuck out of here and get back to New York. If they're making drag queens into stars, I am out. And so I went back to New York, and that's when I sort of reconnected with Randy and Fenton, who had done the music and the video for Rue, and this was just as they were creating World of Wonder. And so I went back, and then when they were there, they were thinking of doing this Club Kid documentary for HBO about the Club Kid scene. And so they were filming, I don't know if you know this story, but they were filming for this documentary at my apartment.
No, I don't know this story. I'm intrigued to hear.
Okay, so the documentary is basically just an origin story of the Club Kids and their influence on fashion and society and pop culture. They talk to me, they talk to Brooke, they talk to Richie Rich, they talk to Keoki, and then Michael sits down. And the first thing out of his mouth is, they're saying that I killed Angel Melendez, and I did it. I killed him. I'm guilty. And he was like just joking, but it was one of those like weird, uncomfortable things, because he had just done it. And he was trying to make a joke out of the fact that there was a rumor that Angel was dead. And so he said, I did it. I killed Angel. And all of a sudden, Randy and Fenton looked at each other, and they said that at that moment, they realized that this little documentary about the Club Kids was about to get much bigger than they realized, because they just had Michael Ehrlich confessing to murder on camera. And so they went back to HBO, and they were like, I think we need to change the focus of this documentary. And so they turned it into the documentary about Angel and Michael. But until then, it was just, if Michael hadn't sat down and decided to make a joke out of it, then it never would have been Party Monster.
So did you have some of your writing about that time before, or did you write your book, Disco Bloodbath, as a reaction to the confession?
Well, what happened was, like I said, I had gone to Miami to write a book, and I did. I wrote a book that I still love. I think it's fantastic. I love it. But I wasn't able to sell it. I wasn't able to do anything with it because I wasn't well known enough, and I wasn't taken seriously as a writer, and I couldn't get a literary agent. I mean, I was just having problems with all of that. And so after I left New York and moved to LA, and Randy and Fenton were in LA, and they were finishing up the documentary, we all had dinner together. And I said, I have this book, and maybe, you helped Rue, maybe you can help me get this published. And they read it, and they were like, yeah, we love this. But wouldn't it be better if you wrote about the club kids, and you wrote about Michael, and you wrote about what happened? And I said, I don't really want to do that. That doesn't interest me at all. And they said, well, if you do that, we can tie it into the documentary, and then maybe, maybe there's a movie to be made, blah, blah, blah. And if you do that, then it will help you get a literary agent and help you place you in a publishing house. And then maybe after that, maybe once you're established, then you can go back and you get this other book and get that published once you have your agent. And I said, well, oh my God, okay. And I was sort of like, I was just like, oh, well, I don't want to do this. And so I sat down and I was like, well, if I write this damn book, it's not going to be about Michael Elegant, it's going to be about me. And I'm going to make it more about me. And by God, they're going to rue the day that they asked me to write about Michael Elegant. And so I ended up just tossing Disco Bloodbath off in like a fury. I was angry, and I was disappointed that the club scene had collapsed, and that I was now in LA, and it looked like Michael had gotten away with the murder at that point, and I was mad about that. And so I wrote Disco Bloodbath in, a couple months, and then Randy and Fenton immediately helped me get me an agent, and then it ended up at Simon & Schuster very quickly, and it all just sort of came about. And like I said, I didn't really care about any of that, writing about Michael Ehrlich. And I wanted to get this other book published, and then they wouldn't publish the other book. And so then I couldn't get another book. I kept giving them idea after idea after idea and submitting all these proposals. And so all anyone really wanted was the Michael Ehrlich Club Kid story. So that's what I ended up doing, and that's what happened.
But it's so fantastic. It's such the original print of the books are like heavily, highly superstar collectible things now. So
they were there was a bookfinder.com came out. We would come out with a list every year of the most the highest in demand out of print books. And it was always Winston Churchill's autobiography, Madonna's sex book, and Disco Bloodbath. Mm-hmm. We're always like the top three for like almost 10 years. It was very funny.
It is so amazing and such a part of my growing up. I had this really bizarre evening where I was very drunk, so this could be a figment of my imagination, but I really don't think it was. But in my hometown of Brighton, my friend was working at the strip club here. We have like one strip club, so I was popping in to see her and help her fish for clients or whatever. And I am convinced Macaulay Culkin was in the strip club in Brighton. And all of these articles came out like the week after about Macaulay Culkin being in Brighton. And he was putting on this really strange English accent. And we walked through Brighton to where I used to live in this big square in the middle of Brighton. And he took me to this house, and it was the house above the big YouTuber PewDiePie. And I was like, I'm absolutely 100% convinced it was Macaulay Culkin. But
you were hanging out with someone, you went to another party with them, and you walked to the party, and you never found out if it was Macaulay or not?
No, I couldn't work it out, but he was fascinated with me. He thought I was hysterical and quite dramatic, I think.
It does sound like Macaulay to put on a fake British accent, and it does sound like him to be at a strip club, and it does sound like him to be hanging in a place above PewDiePie. So I think all three of those things sound very Macaulay. So I believe it probably was too.
He was in a very strange suit with a hat. It was like a Charlie Chaplin kind of thing. And he had a moustache at the time. And then all these articles came out that he'd popped off a tour bus and went into a club in Brighton. It was just the most surreal thing. There you go.
That totally sounds like him. He's just he's so fascinating. He just could talk about him endlessly.
I liked him immensely. But how did that come together? Because he didn't do a movie for quite a long time before he did Party Monster.
I think Richie Rich was his last movie before.
Yeah,
Party Monster. But there was a music video, a Sonic Youth video, I think it was, that he was in, and I remember he was also, it was very druggy, and they were sort of sexualizing those lips. They were fetishizing them, like just really close up, and he was all like licking his lips, and he was all sweaty, and it was like he was with these like I ask everybody to go find this video, because it was sort of a renaissance for Macaulay, where people were starting to think about him differently than the child star. And I think when Randy and Fenton were casting the movie, they say that Macaulay was always their only choice, and they kept approaching him and approaching him and approaching him. This was after the Sonic Youth video, and he wouldn't do it. And I don't think he would take a meeting with them, but finally they did, and it was because of Macaulay that they were able to get Chloe Sevigny, Seth Green, Marilyn Manson, Natasha Lyonne. Like everyone else fell in line after Macaulay signed on. Like they couldn't get anybody to even look at the script until Macaulay agreed to.
It's amazing. I find it so strange that was Marilyn Manson, because for so many years I didn't know that was him in the movie.
I also remember about casting too, and this is that when they were trying to come up with tossing around other ideas, they were always, I was so frustrated because, wait, let me see if, hold on, I can't remember this. They would say, okay, they'd say, well, Fenton would say, maybe we should have Brad Pitt be Michael and Andy Dick be James. Or they'd say, they'd come up with someone like really beautiful for Michael, and then they'd say, who's that awful Just Shoot Me guy? David Spade. They wanted David Spade for me. And I was so insulted with the people that they kept suggesting for me that when they finally landed on Seth, I was like, yes, please, Seth. Oh my God.
It's such a classic. Did you want anything to be represented differently that ended up being in the final?
A little bit. There was a different opening scene in that would sort of was more like my book, in which Seth comes tumbling out of a police station in full drag, and then is like goes through a snowstorm and gets to Michael's house, and then because that's the first place he thinks to go, and then when he gets there, Michael sets up the tea and heroin, and it confesses that he had killed Angel, and that's how my book starts. And then everything else is a flashback. But the movie studios and the producers and everything said, no, you have to get Macaulay Culkin in drag, smoking crack, first scene to hook, because that's your get, that's your hook. We've got this child star, and we've got him in a diaper and covered in blood doing drugs. That was like the whole shocker of the movie was that. So they had to scrap everything and then re-edit it to get to what it was we have now. And so they had to take that scene out, and I thought that was a really good scene.
Did you have a relationship with not the real Michael Alec after the movie came out? Like I feel rude asking you, because I understand he's passed away in the last couple of years, and if you don't want to speak about it, we can skip.
Well, no, the thing is, and I'm really frustrated and irritated with myself, because when Michael went into prison and I wrote Disco Bloodbath, there were things that I needed to know and that I didn't remember, that I know the only other person in the world who would remember as I was writing it would be Michael. And so I would write to Michael and say, what was that party where we did blah, blah, blah? And what was so-and-so, what was Betty Blue Boobs wearing at the Gautier show in 1989? Or, like things like that. And so he and I would write back and forth, and I would give him updates on the book and the documentary and the movie. And during that time, he was always writing and calling me from prison, saying how sorry he was and how he wanted to change. And when he got out, he wanted to give back to the community. He wanted to do, work with, LGBTQ youths and people at risk. And HIV, and he wanted to do homeless people, prisoners. He had all these like ideas of things that he wanted to do after he got out of prison. And he really wanted to sort of rehabilitate himself and rehabilitate his image and try and just be a better person. And so I stood by him that whole time, and I remained his friend. And I always would explain it to people and say that, he's family. And if I've known you for 10 years, you are automatically family. And when you're family, you don't have to approve of your family. And you don't have to like your family. You don't have to like what your family does, but you stand by them. And that's how I sort of felt about Michael. And, plus the fact that he said that he wanted to change. And I believed that, and I wanted to help him. Well, then he got out of prison, and he immediately went back to partying and trying to throw parties and doing drugs and just going back. He took 10 steps backwards is what he did. And I had, like I said, I was standing by him, and I feel like I lost a lot of friends for people who were like, why are you still hanging out with him? Why are you still talking to him? He's a piece of shit. And he was a piece of shit. But I had hoped that he would change, and he didn't. And then he died in December, and on Christmas Day, which was a fuck you to everybody, it's makes me so mad. But I couldn't be shocked. I couldn't be surprised. I was shocked, but I couldn't be surprised because, he'd been a drug addict for 30 years, and that's a good run, I guess, for a drug addict. So it wasn't surprising when he finally passed away.
I'm so sorry. And I think that what you did by standing by him was decent, because you never know what people get caught up in and the actions that can incur because of things like drugs. But I think it was the time period that he was in prison was such an adjustment in the world into just technology changed so drastically at that time. And I couldn't imagine how it must have been to experience iPhones and like this queer culture with different language and young kids that look like club kids but have no idea about the history. And it's very surreal. It's like the pocket of time he was in prison was such a huge evolution, I think.
Well, it's sort of like, I would think it's sort of like going into prison in the 50s and coming out in the 70s. It's like that, how much the world had changed. It's that same thing happened. Like you said, he had never been on, he'd never been on a computer. He'd never had an iPhone. Didn't know what Google was or Instagram or Facebook. And so when he got out, and this is another thing that I'm a little frustrated with myself, because I went to World of Wonder and I said we should be chronicling his going back into society and watch him have to relearn all these things. And I think that's sort of a fascinating documentary, is sort of a follow-up to Party Monster, is what happens when someone gets out of prison and they've been like essentially a caveman coming into the modern world. And so we started following him around when he got out of prison, and for 5 years we followed him around. We have 5 years of footage that I don't know what we're going to do with, but eventually it became obvious that he really wasn't changing, and he was dealing drugs near the end. He was I'm pretty sure he was dealing drugs, and he was getting very messy again, and it looked like the documentary just sort of lost its purpose. So I don't know what's going to happen to that.
Maybe it could be formed into like his redemption as like a lesson not to do this, or God, I couldn't even imagine.
Definitely. I mean, that's always been the Michael Alig, story, is that it's but you don't like people. There's a truism in Hollywood that, like, if you have a sad ending, it's not good. People don't like to leave the theater feeling sad. It's not going to sell. So, I mean, the fact is that there is, how do you make the story sellable?
God, well, after this pandemic where everyone's watching these tragic Princess Diana documentaries on repeat in the UK, sell it here.
It's true. I mean, I just, I don't know. I do think though that I have all these letters from Michael. I have 17 years of letters from Michael in which he documents his prison experience. And to me, Michael was working on his autobiography, and it was all the Club Kids and Angel and all of that. And the stuff that I feel has been done a million times, and the story's been told and told over and over again. But what fascinates me is how a flamboyant gay man can go into the state prison system in New York and end up sort of like running the prison. And he, ended up having, he was organizing, Hollywood Squares nights for the gang members, and he had a lot of fun in prison from what the letters come. I mean, he was doing drugs, and he was hanging out with like all the trans girls and the drag queens, and he was both in all the Latin Kings, a gang there, remembered him from the club days, and he lived in the Bronx for a long time, and they would always be like, Mike, get me on the list, and he was always putting everybody on the list. So when he got into prison, like a lot of the people there remembered him from the clubs, and so he was both in like the Aryan Nation and the Latin Kings, which is sort of unheard of. And the head of the Latin Kings said that he would protect him so that there was never any problems, and like he had this sort of, he was like a sort of a superstar in prison. And to me, all of that he's telling these crazy stories in its letters, that to me is the book. That's how a gay boy manages to get through 17 years of prison. That's fascinating to me.
Definitely. Oh my God. Prison is I just can't get my head around what happens inside prisons, because I don't like to imagine like scary things, but I think it's probably very scary.
To be fair, I mean, he did his first, year in prison was just terrifying. He was getting beat up, and I mean, things were. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And he was in solitary for 3 years at one time. He got into a lot of trouble in prison, and But all of that, I think, that is all interesting too, and that he managed to come out of it and essentially be the same person, that's what's so weird to me, is that 17 years of prison didn't change him at all. You think of like the Count of Monte Cristo or something where or poor Oscar Wilde, who was in, Reading Gaul or whatever for 2 years doing hard labor, and he came out and he was a broken man and was never the same. Michael was in for 17 years and came out and was exactly the same person. So I think it says something to his being a sociopath or psychotic that it wasn't able to break him at all.
Gosh, there's so many things in there. You actually did another fabulous bit that became a film called Freak Show, and did that come out as a movie in 2018 and had Bette Midler in it?
Yeah, 2017, 2018, one of those. It's funny because I had written that. I finally got another book contract, and it was a young adult book. It was they approached me, Dalton? No, who was it? Penguin, I guess. Approached me and asked if I was interested in writing a young adult book. And I was like, I'm a 40-year-old drag queen. What do I know about teenagers? But then I thought, well, I was a teenage drag queen, and it was hard. And no matter how fabulous how much the world has changed, it's still hard to be, gay in school. I think it's easier now than it was in 2007.
Yes.
But at the time, there hadn't been a drag queen main character in young adult fiction. And so it was sort of new. And it wasn't a coming out story, which was sort of been done to death. And it was, but it was about bullying. It was about a kid being bullied for being a drag queen in high school, which at that time wasn't part of the national conversation in America. People weren't talking about LGBTQ bullying and things like that. So it was a little bit ahead of its time. And I think that that's why it didn't sell. I think if it had come out like 5 years later, it might have gotten a little more press. But I'm tooting my own horn and saying that I'm once again I'm ahead of the curve as always.
Definitely.
Yeah. But then it took about 10 years to get made into a movie, and it pretty right off the bat, it went to Flower Films, which is Drew Barrymore's production company.
Mm-hmm.
And she was very much she was pushing it, and she really wanted to help get it made. And it went through a number of directors and stars, and every time it would be about ready to go, like we'd lose the director because he had a prior commitment or something like that, and so we'd have to go scramble, find someone else. And then finally it was languishing and it was about to not happen, and Maven Films was co-producing with Flower Films, and Maven Films is Trudy Styler, Sting's wife,
mm-hmm.
who was the producer of all those Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch, all the, what's his name?
Oh God, my brain's dead.
Anyway, she was a producer of a lot of movies in England, and she said, well, why don't I direct? She had never directed before, and so she was the money woman. And so they said, yes, well, of course. And so the minute she said that she was going to direct, she said, well, I'll call Bette Midler. She lives above me in New York, and I'll just call Bette and see if she can do it. And Bette said, okay. And then she said, well, and then why don't we get who else? It was Abigail Breslin and Laverne Cox and all these other. I mean, there was the tennis guy, John McEnroe, was in it, and he lived downstairs from her. And so she was just able to like call people and say, I'm doing this. Do you have a week to come upstate New York and film? And she just, the minute she said she wanted to do it, it was made in about like 5 months from that point on. And so she's just a magical creature who gets shit done. And I love her. I worship her. I think she's so fabulous for what she did with my book.
Oh, it's fabulous. What are you working on next? I obviously know you do the iconic transformation series, which I've been on, and you do the column for WoW and the blog for WoW. Are you working on anything next?
So every week on Sirius XM Radio Andy, we do the WoW report, in which we list the top 10 things that make us go WoW each week. And that's really fun. I have a number of projects that I'm working on. Now, there's a podcast that I think is going to be up and running pretty soon. And I have a couple books that I have on my computer that I'm sort of fiddling around with, but I don't know that they're going to be ready in the next year or so. There's still a lot of work to be done on them.
Oh my God, I can't wait. Well, if you ever need a guest on your podcast, I would love to be.
Yes. And I'm not doing transformations anymore, but I want to do, the thing about transformations that I loved so much was just meeting all the, creative young kids of the day and just sort of getting to sort of noodle around in their minds and in their wardrobes and figure out what makes them tick. And I want to keep doing things like that. But obviously we had to stop doing transformations for a year, and then I don't know that it's going to start up again. So, but yes, at some point we need to get you back over here.
I'd love to, because I did my sort of girl techniques, the sort of sculpting techniques, but I never really did a look. So I'd love to do a proper look and do something crazy.
Well, I was on your Instagram earlier today, and I loved some of your looks, girl.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. I'm so excited to listen to this back, because I am a fan, as you know.
About anything. I was just rambling the whole time. We need to do the whole thing over.
No, it was fantastic. I had such a fun time.
Well, wait, no. We have to go back for a minute. You have to ask other questions about the early days.
Okay, I can ask more. I'd love to do that.
And here I am directing you. Go back, darling. I'm not letting you go until I tell my whole story.
Well, I didn't know if you had like an hour slot, so I was following the hour, but I will happily ask more questions.
We can do it. We can do a little bit more. I don't have anything to do until 3.
Okay, cool. So when you were younger and you were kind of like transitioning from the celebrity thing to the whole club kid dynamic, did you like actively make all your own looks, or did you collaborate with other people? Because you had so many incredible looks. I saw you as a goblin with a big nose and all different things. Did you do all of that yourself?
Well, kind of. I mean, a lot, so much. People always say, like, do you miss it? And do you miss the parties? And do you miss the club kids? And do you miss the club scene? And, what I miss is the getting ready with a bunch of people, like just having a whole bunch of friends over and like, having cocktails and everybody sitting in front of the mirror at the same time. And, you say, will you do my eyebrows? And, oh my God, I love those lips. Will you do those lips on me? And, oh, let me do that. Oh no, girl, do it like this. That sort of thing. And then you're getting ready and everyone is laughing at what you're wearing. And then someone says, oh my God, you've got to wear this with that. And then like everybody is just sort of collaborating with everybody. And I miss that more than the actual clubs and the actual parties. I miss that sort of like sense of family camaraderie. Cause that was, and so many of those looks, were just there was like a circle of clothes that sort of got passed around. Like, like someone would have a fabulous, necklace or hat or whatever like that. And then eventually at some point, everyone, you knew had been photographed in it at some point because everyone just sort of passed everything around.
Did there like become superstars like in terms of their creativity? Because when I was a kid, I used to use this website called GeoCities, which was on Yahoo, and they did this website that was like all of the club kids, all of the Blitz people, and then there was like all of your old pictures and Kabuki Starshine and Matthew and Zaldi. Like, who were the big creative stars of that era? Because I know Matthew, who I adore and was so supportive when I was doing YouTube.
Well, you talk about transformations, and one of the reasons I did it was so that I could have Matthew on the show and I could say I'd been painted by Matthew once in my life and get a picture out of it to have proof. Yeah, I mean, it's different. The club kids, the way the movie and the documentary make it look as if it was just like a 2 or 3 year period, or it was very fast, but it was actually, from 1987 to about 97 or 98 were the peak years. And so there was like a first wave, a second wave, a third wave, a fourth generation, a fifth generation. Every like 18 months, it seems like there was an entire new crew. And so at different points, there were different people along the way. In the early days, there was, it was a lot more, it wasn't quite as makeup oriented as it became later on, but there was Nick Nasty, who was just he was so fantastic, and he was sort of he had sort of a gothy look about him. There was Julie Jules, of course, and Tony Senecal, Lincoln Paulsgrove. I mean, there were so many people that were really fabulous, and then there was like a Jenny Go Getter and Oh No Denise, I think was her name. They were just all these sort of like young kids that were Michael Tron. They were all coming into the scene. Armin Ra was really fabulous. And then by the 90s is when the rave influence started coming in and the makeup started getting crazier and crazier. And that's when you have Wallpaper and Richie Rich and Kabuki and Kide and Sacred Boy and Freeze and Bella Bolsky. I mean, there's so many people. I mean, I could just name, forever. And then like Connie Girl and Cody Ravioli, Bree, Kenny. Oh my God. I could just sit here and list, the different club the different eras for the next hour.
I love it. And there were people like Amanda Lepore and Sophia Lamar.
Amanda, oh my God, yes. Amanda was so funny because she came onto the scene in 88 or 89. And I remember people were shocked. I mean, shocked at the way she looked, with the lips and the boobs and the plucked eyebrows and the plastic surgery. But it was, if you look back at her early looks, I mean, it was nothing. And it's so crazy that people were blown away by something that every woman in Beverly Hills now has. You know, she was like 30 years ahead of her time with the fillers and the lips and everything, and the body and the corsets and all of that. But what she became afterwards, you know, in watching her evolution of her style and her look, it's crazy that we ever thought that she was crazy when she became like it's, I don't know if I'm explaining that properly, but it's funny. And she was kind of a dizzy blonde. She was sort of she played the dizzy blonde. She was doing like a Jane Mansfield type caricature. But now, after 30 years in the club scene and hanging out with David LaChapelle and Dita and you know, all these fabulous, you know, Suzanne, she's razor sharp. She is one of the smartest cookies you will ever meet. And you know, she'll still play dumb blonde, but she is just, I mean, she is amazing.
Yeah, I've never ever met her. I've always been so infatuated with her, and I met Glamorous Monique for the first time. I think I was probably about 17 or something. I was sneaking into the clubs in London, and we did the podcast, and I found out that on the day she'd come to England was the day she stopped her job as a parole officer or something. And I was like, so she was a parole officer with that sort of similar siliconized look, but she was like in the office. I was fascinated by her story because I see her and Amanda as almost like the East and West Coast parallels.
Yeah. I mean, Amanda is one of the sweetest. I mean, if you ever meet her, you're going to fall in love. You're just going to be eating out of her hand because she is just the kindest, sweetest woman you will ever meet. And you think that you're going to be intimidated because the look. But the minute she opens her mouth, you're just going to be butter. I mean, it's amazing. And Glamorous Monique is a whole different, you know, bag of nuts because she is fabulous. I love Glamorous Monique, but she's a wild one. That one.
Yes. I just love the whole, like, the sort of the lineage to that Selka, the adult movie star that was like that sort of. And we were talking about, we had a convo off the podcast, but the behind the scenes was even more crazier. But I remember in London, I think when there started to be like a sort of repeat of what was going on, I think in the 80s with the trans women with the exaggerated silicone work, where like Pete Burns started to play with his lips and there was this new filler that they were using all around. And I used to be just obsessed with Pete Burns. And I think World of Wonder produced his documentary, the Pete Burns Unspun thing, which I've got downloaded on my hard drive in case it goes missing. I love it so much.
Did the Unspun, and they also did the one, I don't know if it was the same one, where he was in jail and he was looking for a personal assistant, and some fan came and got him out of jail, like spraying for his bail, but on the condition that he live with him.
Yes.
And so I wonder, was that Unspun or was that a different one?
That was Unspun, and then he had a series where he was searching for an assistant.
Oh, so it was two different things. It was
yes.
Two, okay. Yeah. But and it was funny because they met Pete at the Party Monster party in London at the premiere. He was there, and we were all hanging out and spending time together, and that's how Randy and Fenton got the idea to do something with him.
Oh, I see. Yes, because there were people that were kind of crossing the ponds, as we said earlier, like Lee Bowery and Suzanne Barge. But how did Wigstock play into the scene? Like, was Wigstock just this sort of like festival that was different to the Club Kids? Because I know I've listened to every Lady Bunny podcast, there probably is, and she kind of said that she was working with the Club Kids as well as doing her drag. So I didn't understand how the two kind of intersected.
Well, it's sort of like what I was talking about before, how there were drag bars that were for, you know, the pickup scene. Then there was things like Limbo Lounge and Pyramid, which was about doing more theatrical performance art type things. And then there was the boy bar scene, and then there was the Club Kids scene. And they were all interconnected, and we all knew each other, and we all hung out together, but there were different goals for each different scene. And Bunny was mostly pyramid and was doing things with Sister Dimension and like Delight was probably there, Dean Johnson. So I believe Pyramid, the Wigstock started, it was one night after Pyramid, and everybody just went over to Tompkins Square Park across the street and stood in the band shell and just put on a show, all drunk and out of their minds. I think that was the first one in like 84 or 85. And then every year it got bigger and bigger, and she would pull in all the, the different performers from Boy Bar and, performers from, around the country eventually, and around the world. But it started off as a pyramid thing, I believe.
I see. See, I don't really have the geography of New York down because I've only been in New York one time through transit. I'm still waiting for my New York experience. I need to get my head around it all.
Thank you. It's funny because it's changed. It just changes so much now, and it's mostly Brooklyn, Queens, and it's places that we would never go are the fabulous places now. So
yes, and they've got Bushwick instead of Wigstock.
Who is the girl who does that? Anyway, I'll figure it out. Anyway, cut that out. The fact that I don't know someone's name.
That's okay. We're going through like this crazy time in lockdown, and we've been through like this pandemic, and often when there's these big momentous world events that keep people locked down, the outcome of that is these empty spaces that are just blooming with creativity when things go back to normal. Do you think that because New York's been hit so hard that there will be this renovation where these spaces that maybe were shops that are now unused are going to be clubs again, or how do you think it's going to change after this hopefully goes back to normal?
Well, it's weird because, you kept thinking that the recession and Watergate and Vietnam led to punk. And you think that, the problems of the 60s led to the 60s revolution, and or the repression of the 50s led to the 60s, sexual revolution. You think that the repression of the Republicans, you would think that the Trump era, you would think that the pandemic would lead to this wild burst of creativity. I haven't seen evidence that it's happening yet. I don't know if the world is too diffused through social media that there can't be that buildup anymore, where it's just like an explosion. I don't know that things can't. I don't think that scenes can percolate the way they used to for 4 or 5 years before getting discovered by the media. I think that the minute something happens, the minute someone comes up with an idea, it goes around the world 10 times on Facebook and Instagram, and I don't know that gives people the time to gestate an idea. So I don't think that the world can work the way that it used to, where, they say that, during the Black Plague, Shakespeare wrote, what was it? King Lear. I don't know that we're going to get a lot of King Lears out of this pandemic.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. I mean, it's sort of depressing to think about. Because there is so much creativity going on today. I'm not saying that at all. I mean, there are so many amazing kids doing so many amazing new things. I just don't know that anything can stick the way or come together and congeal into one big blob when there's 10 million famous TikTokers, I think it's all spread out so much, and it's also diffused, that I don't think it can come together and explode.
That does make a lot of sense. I think one common thing that I've seen that's been like a blatant. I don't understand why the news coverage has not been there, but because everyone's been so docile, they've not been able to drive their cars or travel on aeroplanes. So much stuff has changed in the last year, just like in the rivers and lakes and the animal stuff, and people have been starting to talk about the climate in a lot more active ways in like the last 4 years or whatever. But I'm noticing so many people take an interest in the environment in a way that I never have seen before. Like, I come from a very strange family where my grandparents were like animal activist kind of people, and I've never eaten meat, and things like that were just natural in my life. But so much of that has changed, I think, especially since the Trump presidency. And there's been so many like documentaries that have just come out, like Seaspiracy, and people, I think, in some ways are being creative, but not in a hedonistic way. I think people are starting to look at the environment in a way that wasn't, I guess in California people do, but
I think you're absolutely correct. I do think that there's the new generation is much more politically aware, and they're much more environmentally responsible, and they're much more open to ideas that the world has to change than they were before. And I think it is more turning outward as opposed to turning inward and doing hedonistic things, and that is something that's come out of the like Republican repression, and in the problems that UK and France are having with their right wing people. Mm-hmm. I think that it does. The new kids are rebel in a way that is more responsible.
It's something that I've definitely noticed in the political activism from younger people today, is that there is a lot of, I think because the whole table has shifted towards the right, so the left is now kind of in the middle in some regards, and I've seen so many people almost slip off both sides of it, because there's people that are progressive lefts that don't trust the media and they don't trust the corporate investments in the politics, and then there are people on the right that don't trust the political system, and they were in these like places that lost their industry during when Obama was in presidency, and they've slipped off the ends and formed this sort of like anti-political delusion. And on one side it's like very extreme progression, and then on the other side it's this QAnon thing. But I'm fascinated by what's going to happen next, because people in my family members, I'm not going to mention which ones, but have been talking to me about the flat earth and watching these crazy documentaries, and I'm like, oh Jesus, take the wheel. Like that bit is crazy to me.
Well, it's funny because there's a guy that I follow on Twitter who is absolutely adorable and is very smart and very funny, but his political views just are so far to the left that nothing like Biden can do, nothing anyone can do is good enough for him. And I wonder, if so many of these people who are on both sides that you say that are falling off, they are so intent upon making the perfect be the enemy of the good, mm-hmm. Where if it's not absolutely perfect, if it's just good, they won't settle for just good, and that sort of seems to be the problem with politics everywhere today.
Definitely. And the transparency that's come from social media has been just insane, because I think people are starting to talk about like the whole deep fake things and how their pictures are being changed to create propaganda in a way that I don't think has ever been done before. I mean, even there was a video that went viral amongst the right-wing sort of side of things recently of Joe Biden on the lawn, and it was like the green screen effect of the microphone passed over his hand, and I'm not surprised people would think that's a bit dodgy because I saw it for myself.
I was watching the Q documentary, and I just on HBO, and the idea that people really think that Bill and Hillary are running a sex porn child ring and eating children and drinking their blood and out of a pizza parlor, like, do they really believe that, or are they just saying they believe that to like own the libs? Like, nobody could really believe that, can they?
Oh, I think so, especially in the spiritual community, because I follow all these podcasts with people that channel like aliens and things, and for about 10 years they've been saying this stuff, especially about the royals and things.
But the royals aren't eating children. I mean, they aren't. They just aren't. I just don't understand the people who can like legitimately say that I was in a plane and I looked out the window and I couldn't see the curve of the world, so it's flat. Like, really? Like you're gonna base your whole theory of science on? I just don't understand people anymore. I'm old. I just don't get it.
I find it very fascinating. I am going to have to run because I'm running out of tape on my podcast. But
I'm sorry. I know I was running out of. I'm getting my voice. I'm losing my voice too. So
I've had such a pleasure chatting though, and thank you so much, James, for taking the time to speak to me. And I'd love to catch up soon.
Can't wait to see you again sometime soon.
I'd love that.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, and have a lovely day. And I'll speak to you soon.
Bye-bye. Yay.
Bye. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this podcast. It's been a pleasure to interview James, and he has got an incredible podcast himself, which is with World of Wonder. There's also a sort of interview, I think, behind the scenes of it on World of Wonder Plus, which I've had, and he's incredible. So follow him on all his social media. He's always giving insight into different things, and it's such a joy. Thank you, guys. Check out agitprop.world and explore.